In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where stars twinkled like diamonds scattered across an endless velvet canvas, there existed a peculiar planet known as Cryan. Unlike any other world in the cosmos, Cryan was a living paradox, a planet entirely composed of sentient ice formations that pulsed with an inner light, shimmering in hues of turquoise and violet. The inhabitants of this frozen wonderland were the glacians, crystalline beings whose forms shifted between solid ice and flowing liquid states, depending on their emotional state. Among these ethereal creatures lived Princess Leora, a being of extraordinary beauty and profound isolation. Her form was more intricate than most glacians, with delicate frost patterns weaving through her translucent body like ancient lacework. Born with a unique condition that caused her to freeze uncontrollably when emotionally distressed, she had been deemed disabled by her people, a term that carried heavy weight in their society. While other glacians could control their temperature fluctuations with ease, Leora's body would spontaneously form thick layers of unyielding ice, trapping her in place for hours or even days at a time. The royal court of Cryan, though outwardly supportive, maintained a careful distance from their princess. Their fear wasn't born of malice but rather practicality. Any sudden emotional response from Leora could result in entire sections of their ice palace becoming permanently frozen. Over time, this led to a subtle yet pervasive exclusion. Court gatherings would mysteriously shift locations when Leora entered a room. Diplomatic meetings would conclude just as she arrived. Even her own family, while loving in their way, had developed elaborate systems of communication that avoided direct interaction, lest they trigger one of her episodes. Leora's chambers, located in the highest spire of the palace, offered breathtaking views of the aurora-lit skies but served equally well as a gilded cage. She spent countless hours watching the vibrant colors dance across the heavens, wondering what it would feel like to move freely among her people without fear of freezing them out, literally and figuratively. The other glacians, meanwhile, had constructed an intricate web of excuses and alternative arrangements, all designed to maintain a safe distance from their troubled princess. They spoke of her with reverence but also with a certain degree of dread, whispering about the frozen curse that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Despite her isolation, Leora possessed a remarkable gift, the ability to manipulate ice crystals with unparalleled precision. Where other glacians could create simple structures or basic tools, Leora could weave entire symphonies of frozen art, crafting sculptures so detailed they seemed to breathe. Yet this talent only deepened her solitude, for her creations often required such intense focus that they triggered her condition, leaving her trapped within her own masterpieces. The palace gardens were filled with these frozen monuments to her skill and loneliness, each one more magnificent and more isolating than the last. The human warrior first appeared during the Great Thaw Festival, an annual celebration marking the brief period when Cryan's surface temperatures rose enough to allow liquid water to flow freely. Captain Elias Varn of the Interstellar Diplomatic Corps had been sent to establish formal relations with the Glacian monarchy, his mission complicated by centuries of failed attempts at meaningful contact between humans and the icebound species. Most diplomats had returned empty-handed, unable to bridge the cultural chasm between warm-blooded humans and the temperamental ice beings. Elias was different. A veteran of numerous first-contact missions, he bore the scars of both physical battles and diplomatic failures. His dark eyes, framed by lines etched by years of staring into alien suns, held a depth of understanding that transcended mere experience. When he stepped into the grand hall of the Ice Palace, his breath visible in the chilled air, something unusual happened. None of the glacians immediately withdrew. Instead, they watched him with cautious curiosity, their crystalline forms shifting in slow, contemplative rhythms. What set Elias apart wasn't just his diplomatic training or combat skills, it was his approach. Rather than treating the glacians' temperature sensitivities as obstacles to overcome, he embraced them as opportunities for connection. He had studied their culture obsessively, learning not just their language but their non-verbal cues, the subtle ways their forms changed in response to emotion. During initial meetings, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to read these shifts, adjusting his behavior accordingly. When a Glacian elder began to frost over during negotiations, Elias instinctively lowered his voice and slowed his movements, helping to stabilize the situation without either party losing face. His reputation among the Glacians grew quickly, though not without skepticism. Some viewed his adaptability as manipulation, while others saw it as genuine respect for their ways. Regardless of opinion, his presence created ripples throughout the court, particularly when he requested private audiences with various members of the royal family, including Princess Leora. This request caused considerable consternation among the court officials, who scrambled to find ways to honor the human diplomat's wishes while maintaining their carefully constructed barriers around the princess. Elias, however, proved persistent in the most respectful manner possible. He began incorporating references to Leora's artistic works into diplomatic discussions, demonstrating an intimate knowledge of her creations that surprised even those closest to her. His comments weren't superficial praise but thoughtful observations about how her techniques reflected deeper aspects of Glacian culture. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere around the princess began to change. Courtiers found themselves discussing her work more openly, and the once empty spaces around her chambers became less pronounced. The turning point came during a particularly tense negotiation session. As tempers flared and several Glacians began to frost uncontrollably, threatening to derail months of progress, Elias did something unprecedented. He moved directly toward Princess Leora's position. The court collectively held its breath as he approached her chamber doors, expecting disaster. Instead, he simply placed his hand against the frosted glass, his warmth creating a small, clear circle through which he could see inside. Through this makeshift window, he caught sight of Leora, partially encased in her latest creation, and smiled, not with pity, but with genuine appreciation for the beauty before him. This simple act shattered decades of carefully maintained distance. It wasn't just that Elias had approached the princess. It was how he had done so, with quiet respect, unwavering patience, and an understanding that her condition wasn't something to be feared or avoided, but rather something to be acknowledged and worked with. The court watched in stunned silence as, for the first time in memory, someone didn't turn away from Princess Leora's frozen world, but instead reached out to touch it, literally and figuratively. The moment Elias's hand touched the frosted glass of Leora's chamber, a transformation began that neither could have anticipated. Through the small circle of clarity his warmth had created, Leora saw something in his eyes that she had never encountered before. Not the practiced diplomacy she'd observed in other visitors, nor the veiled apprehension of her own people, but a raw, unfiltered curiosity mixed with something deeper, something that made her crystalline form pulse with unfamiliar energy. For the first time in her existence, she felt seen not as a problem to be managed or a danger to be avoided, but as a being worthy of genuine interest. Their initial exchanges were tentative, conducted through the barrier of her chamber door. Elias would sit cross-legged on the cold floor, speaking softly about his travels across the galaxy, describing worlds where oceans boiled under twin suns and forests glowed with bioluminescent light. Leora listened intently, her form shifting in response to his words, creating intricate patterns in the ice walls that mirrored the images he painted with his stories. When he spoke of Earth's polar regions, she interrupted him, not with words, but with a delicate sculpture that formed itself in mid-air, depicting the auroras he described with perfect accuracy. As days turned into weeks, their conversations evolved beyond mere storytelling. Elias began sharing personal experiences. His childhood on a space station orbiting Proxima Centauri, his first encounter with death during a diplomatic mission gone wrong, the weight of carrying his crew's lives on his shoulders. In return, Leora started expressing herself through her art, creating pieces that revealed fragments of her soul. One particularly haunting sculpture depicted a figure trapped within layers of ice, reaching out toward a distant light. When Elias asked about it, she finally spoke, her voice like the gentle chiming of icicles in a winter breeze. "I've always wondered," she confessed, her form flickering between solid and liquid states, "what it would feel like to be truly understood. My people, they see my condition as something to be contained. You're the first who seems to see it as part of who I am." Her admission triggered a minor freezing episode, but instead of retreating, Elias remained where he was, speaking calmly until she stabilized. This simple act of staying put, of not treating her episode as something to flee from, marked a profound shift in their relationship. Their bond deepened through shared silences as much as through words. Elias discovered that Leora could sense emotions through vibrations in the ice, reading his moods long before he expressed them verbally. In turn, she taught him to interpret the subtle shifts in her crystalline structure, showing him how her excitement manifested in swirling patterns and her sadness in slow, dripping formations. They developed a language that transcended words, communicating through touch against the ice wall and through the art she created in response to his presence. The court watched these developments with growing unease. What had begun as a diplomatic necessity had transformed into something far more complex. Servants whispered about how Elias would spend hours outside Leora's chambers, sometimes sleeping on the cold floor just to be near her. Royal advisors debated whether to intervene, concerned about the precedent this relationship might set. Yet no one dared to separate them, not after witnessing how Elias's presence seemed to give Leora a measure of control over her condition that she'd never shown before. One evening, during a particularly fierce storm that rattled the Ice Palace's foundations, Elias found himself trapped in the corridor outside Leora's chambers when the temperature suddenly dropped. Instead of retreating to safety, he pressed closer to the ice wall, his warmth creating elaborate frost patterns where his hands touched. On the other side, Leora responded by forming matching patterns on her side, their combined efforts creating a symphony of crystalline art that pulsed with shared energy. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully embrace her power, knowing that Elias wouldn't run from the display but would instead meet it with equal intensity. This mutual vulnerability opened new dimensions to their connection. Elias began teaching Leora about human concepts of courage and resilience, drawing parallels between her struggles with her condition and his own battles with trauma. In return, she introduced him to the Galatian philosophy of fractured wholeness, the idea that true strength lies in embracing one's imperfections rather than trying to eliminate them. Their conversations became a dance of cultural exchange, each learning from the other while challenging their preconceived notions about what it meant to be strong, to be whole, to be worthy of connection. The court's reaction to the growing bond between Princess Leora and Captain Elias rippled through the Ice Palace like a seismic disturbance, fracturing centuries-old protocols and assumptions. The Royal Council convened emergency sessions, their crystalline forms vibrating with anxiety as they debated the implications of this unprecedented relationship. Some argued that allowing a human such intimate access to the princess compromised national security, while others worried about setting a dangerous precedent regarding interactions with disabled royals. Yet beneath these official concerns lay a deeper, more unsettling truth. Elias's unwavering acceptance of Leora challenged the very foundation of Galatian society's treatment of those deemed different. The queen, Leora's mother, found herself torn between maternal instincts and royal duty. She paced her private chambers, her form shifting rapidly between solid and liquid states as conflicting emotions coursed through her. Memories of Leora's childhood episodes, the time she had frozen entire wings of the palace, trapping dozens of courtiers, clashed with recent observations of her daughter's newfound stability in Elias's presence. The queen's chief advisor, Lord Terran, whose crystalline structure bore the distinctive sharp edges of long-held prejudices, argued vehemently against any further contact. "We cannot risk our entire diplomatic mission on the whims of a single human," he declared, his voice echoing through the council chamber like cracking ice. Yet opposition to the relationship wasn't universal. Younger courtiers, particularly those who had grown up hearing tales of Leora's artistic genius but had never witnessed it firsthand, began questioning the wisdom of their elders' policies. Lady Syrah, a junior diplomat known for her progressive views, pointed out that Leora's episodes had decreased significantly since Elias's arrival. "Perhaps we've been approaching this all wrong," she suggested during a heated council meeting. "Maybe what our princess needed wasn't protection from her condition, but protection from our fear of it." The tension escalated when Elias, unaware of the political storm brewing around him, requested permission to take Leora on a guided tour of the lower levels of the palace, a section rarely visited by anyone due to its unstable ice formations. The request sparked outrage among traditionalists, who saw it as reckless endangerment of both the princess and potentially hundreds of courtiers. However, the younger generation of Galatians rallied behind the idea, seeing it as an opportunity to challenge long-standing restrictions. Petitions began circulating through the court, some demanding Elias's immediate removal, others supporting greater freedom for Leora. Even among the servants and lower-ranking staff, divisions emerged. Those who had worked in proximity to Leora's chambers for years found themselves re-evaluating their automatic responses to her presence. Old habits, like taking longer routes to avoid passing her quarters or timing meals to coincide with her rest periods, were called into question. Some began deliberately crossing paths with her, testing whether Elias's apparent immunity to triggering her episodes might be replicable. These small acts of defiance against established protocol created an undercurrent of change that threatened to destabilize the carefully maintained order of court life. The scientific community on Cryan added another layer of complexity to the debate. Researchers who had studied Leora's condition since childhood presented conflicting data, some suggesting that human presence might indeed have a stabilizing effect on her episodes, while others warned of potential long-term consequences of exposing her to warm-blooded species. The lead scientist, Dr. Kale, whose own son suffered from a similar but less severe condition, found himself caught between professional caution and personal hope. His reports, meticulously documented yet increasingly ambivalent, fueled both sides of the argument. Amidst this turmoil, the most surprising development came from unexpected quarters. Several senior courtiers, previously staunch supporters of maintaining distance from Leora, began quietly visiting her chambers, always when Elias was present, using his presence as a buffer against their own fears. These visits, initially motivated by political calculation, gradually transformed as witnesses to the genuine connection between the princess and the human warrior found their preconceptions challenged. The sight of Leora laughing, not the polite, controlled laughter expected of royalty, but genuine, crystalline peals that echoed through the halls, proved particularly disarming. The controversy reached a boiling point when news of Elias's intention to extend his stay on Cryan beyond the originally planned diplomatic mission leaked to the press. Traditional media outlets seized upon the story, painting it as everything from a romantic scandal to a threat to Glacian sovereignty. Meanwhile, underground networks of young Glacians began spreading counter-narratives, celebrating the possibility of change and challenging the status quo. Social media platforms, adapted for crystalline communication, lit up with debates about disability rights, interspecies relationships, and the nature of true leadership. Through it all, Elias remained steadfast in his commitment to Leora, navigating the political minefield with the same careful attention he had shown to their personal relationship. He participated in formal hearings, answered questions from skeptical council members, and engaged in public discussions about the importance of embracing difference. Yet perhaps his most powerful statement came through his continued presence in Leora's life. Through every shared meal, every joint artistic creation, every moment of quiet companionship that defied centuries of tradition and expectation. As the seasons on Cryan shifted and the auroras painted ever-changing patterns across the sky, Leora found herself standing at a precipice of transformation. Each day brought new challenges, courtiers testing boundaries, scientists requesting participation in studies, media requests for interviews, but also new possibilities. Through her connection with Elias, she had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her episodes, once sources of shame and isolation, now became moments of artistic expression, her body transforming into living sculptures that told stories of vulnerability and triumph. The palace itself seemed to respond to this evolution. Ice formations that had remained static for generations began shifting and reforming, creating new passageways and chambers that reflected the changing dynamics within. Leora's own quarters, once a fortress of solitude, transformed into a gallery of collaborative art, where human and Glacian influences merged in dazzling displays of creativity. Visitors from across the galaxy began arriving, drawn by rumors of the unprecedented relationship between the human warrior and the disabled alien princess, each bringing new perspectives and possibilities. Yet amidst this whirlwind of change, shadows lingered. Traditionalists continued their resistance, finding new ways to challenge the legitimacy of Leora's evolving role. Young Glacians, inspired by her journey, began advocating for broader reforms in how their society treated those considered different, sparking debates that threatened to fracture the very foundation of their culture. The scientific community remained divided, with some researchers warning of potential risks in continuing the human-Glacian interaction, while others pushed for more radical experiments in interspecies connection. Elias, too, faced his own trials. The demands of his diplomatic mission clashed with his growing commitment to Leora, forcing him to navigate complex decisions about loyalty, to his people, to his mission, and to the connection he had forged on this frozen world. Messages from Earth grew more frequent and urgent, carrying implications that neither he nor Leora could ignore. The weight of representing two worlds, each with its own expectations and limitations, pressed heavily upon him, visible in the new lines etched into his face and the occasional hesitation in his usually confident stride. Most profoundly, Leora herself grappled with the fundamental question of identity. Was she still the isolated princess, defined by her condition and the fears of those around her? Or had she become something else entirely? A bridge between species, a catalyst for change, a being capable of reshaping not just her own destiny but that of her entire world? The answer seemed to lie somewhere in the spaces between human and Glacian, between disabled and able, between tradition and innovation. And as she stood there, caught in this liminal space, she realized that the most important choices were yet to come, choices that would determine not just her future, but the future of everything she had ever known. The moment of decision arrived during the annual Converging Ceremony, when the planet's auroras aligned perfectly with its orbital path, creating a phenomenon that bathed the entire world in shimmering light. It was a sacred time for the Glacians, a moment when the boundaries between past and future seemed to blur. This year, however, the ceremony carried an unprecedented weight. The Royal Council had announced that Princess Leora would address the gathered court, and through them, all of Cryan, for the first time in her life. Whispers rippled through the crowd as glacians from every corner of the planet converged on the Ice Palace, their crystalline forms glowing faintly in anticipation. Elias stood at the edge of the Grand Hall, his presence both a comfort and a provocation. He knew this was Leora's moment, but he also understood the risks. Her condition had always been unpredictable, and the emotional intensity of such a public appearance could easily trigger an episode. Yet, as she emerged from her chambers, her form radiating a calm brilliance that silenced even the most skeptical murmurs, it became clear that something profound had shifted within her. She moved not with hesitation, but with purpose, her steps leaving trails of delicate frost patterns that pulsed like living art. When she reached the dais, she paused, her translucent body shimmering under the auroral glow. For a long moment, there was only silence, a silence so deep it seemed to stretch across the cosmos itself. Then, without preamble, she began to speak. Her voice resonated like chimes caught in a winter wind, each word carrying layers of meaning that transcended language. "I have spent my life behind walls," she said, her gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. "Walls built by fear, not just yours, but mine. Fear of what I might do, who I might hurt, how I might fail. But today, I stand before you not as someone broken, but as someone whole. My condition is not a curse, it is part of who I am. And it is because of this truth that I ask you now, what kind of world do we want to create?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Around her, the ice walls of the palace began to shift, responding to her emotions as they always had. But this time, instead of freezing uncontrollably, she guided the transformation. Intricate sculptures erupted from the walls, depicting scenes of unity and diversity. Humans and glacians working together, disabled beings celebrated rather than feared, cultures blending into something greater than the sum of their parts. It was as if the palace itself was breathing, alive with possibility. The crowd stirred, some awestruck, others uneasy. Lord Terran stepped forward, his sharp-edged form vibrating with barely contained anger. "Princess Leora," he began, his tone cutting through the stillness. "You speak of change, but what of tradition? What of stability? Do you truly believe that embracing outsiders will bring us strength?" Before Leora could respond, Elias stepped forward, his human warmth contrasting sharply with the cold precision of the Glacian court. "Strength isn't found in isolation," he said, his voice steady and firm. "It's found in connection, in understanding. Your people are extraordinary, Lord Terran, but imagine what they could achieve if they stopped seeing difference as a threat and started seeing it as an opportunity." A murmur swept through the hall, voices rising in debate. Some shouted in agreement, while others protested vehemently. The tension escalated until, suddenly, a young Glacian child broke free from the crowd and ran toward Leora. The child's form shimmered with innocence, untouched by prejudice or fear. Reaching out, the child placed a small, glowing crystal into Leora's hand, a gesture so simple yet so powerful that it silenced the room once more. Leora looked down at the crystal, then back at the child. Tears, liquid drops that froze mid-air into tiny jewels, formed in her eyes. "This," she whispered, holding up the crystal, "is what we must become. Not afraid to reach out, not afraid to connect. Not afraid to be vulnerable." The moment seemed to hang suspended in time, the auroras above casting shifting colors over the scene. Slowly, one by one, the Glacians began to approach the dais. Some offered crystals of their own, others simply bowed their heads in acknowledgement. Even Lord Terran, though visibly conflicted, took a hesitant step forward before stopping abruptly, his crystalline edges softening ever so slightly. But just as hope began to bloom, a tremor shook the palace. The ground beneath them shuddered, and the ice walls groaned ominously. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, shards of ice raining down in glittering cascades. Panic threatened to erupt, but Leora raised her hands, her voice ringing out with authority. "Stay calm," she commanded, her form glowing brighter than ever. "This is not destruction, it is rebirth." As she spoke, the trembling intensified, but instead of collapsing, the palace began to reshape itself. Walls dissolved and reformed, creating new spaces filled with light and openness. The once isolated spire where Leora had lived for so many years transformed into a central hub, connected to every part of the structure by flowing pathways of ice that pulsed with vibrant energy. Elias watched in awe as the transformation unfolded, realizing that Leora wasn't just reshaping the palace. She was reshaping the very fabric of Glacian society. The fear that had kept her isolated for so long was being replaced by something far stronger: trust. Trust in herself, trust in her people, and trust in the possibility of a future where no one had to live behind walls anymore. As the tremors subsided and the new palace settled into place, Leora turned to face Elias. Her expression was a mixture of gratitude and resolve, her crystalline form glowing with an inner fire that defied description. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying only to him. "For seeing me. For believing in me. For helping me see that I don't have to choose between being myself and being part of something greater." Elias smiled, his eyes reflecting the same determination. "You never had to choose, Leora. You've always been both. And now, it's time for the rest of the galaxy to see that too." With those words, the ceremony concluded, not with formal speeches or rituals, but with a shared understanding that had taken root in the hearts of everyone present. The barriers that had once divided them were crumbling, replaced by bridges of ice and light. And at the center of it all stood Leora and Elias, two beings from vastly different worlds, united by a bond that transcended species, culture, and fear. In the days that followed, Cryan underwent a renaissance. The reforms Leora had envisioned began to take shape, driven not just by her leadership but by the collective will of her people. Disabled Glacians, long marginalized, found themselves welcomed into positions of influence, their unique abilities celebrated rather than feared. Humans and other alien species were invited to collaborate with Glacians on projects ranging from art to science, forging connections that enriched both sides. Yet the journey was far from over. Challenges remained, and old prejudices did not vanish overnight. But for the first time in centuries, the Glacians dared to dream of a future unburdened by fear, a future where differences were not obstacles but opportunities, where vulnerability was not weakness but strength. And as the auroras danced across the sky once more, painting the frozen world in hues of turquoise and violet, Leora and Elias stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they had proven that even the coldest hearts could thaw, and even the hardest ice could bend toward the light. As the auroras faded, Leora took Elias's hand, her crystalline form glowing softly. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, her voice steady and sure. Around them, the newly transformed palace shimmered with hope, its walls alive with the promise of change. The Glacians, once divided, now moved as one, their forms reflecting a shared determination. Elias smiled, knowing their bond had sparked something extraordinary, a revolution of acceptance and unity. Together, they stepped forward, ready to guide Cryan into an uncharted future. The stars above seemed brighter, as if acknowledging the courage of a princess and a warrior who defied fear. And in that moment, the frozen world of Cryan began to thaw, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Their journey was far from over, but they faced it together, hand in hand. For the first time, the galaxy felt limitless, and so did their dreams.